Hi, and welcome to Europe to the 1500s. Now, we've been to Europe before, but now we're going to look at the later medieval and early Renaissance. Now, some things before we get going are that you need to forget this idea of Western European dominance. The fact that Europe is now, or at least was for the majority of our history, dominant over others is not a fait accompli. It is not guaranteed. At the point that we start this lecture in the 11th and 12th and 13th century, Europeans are economically weak compared to China, India, the Middle East, and even parts of Africa, and politically fragmented. The nation states really haven't gelled yet. We also have to give up this idea of inevitability. Just because something did happen doesn't mean it was meant to happen or that it would always happen that way. It's a logical fallacy often referred to as a post hoc fallacy, so don't fall into that one. Part and parcel of that post hoc fallacy is this idea of divine guidance. A lot of what happened in Europe is often written of in terms of God's will. For instance, the Black Plague or the discovery of the Western Hemisphere. Well, those aren't necessarily God's will. Some of those are just bad luck, or sometimes it's good luck, or sometimes it's just coincidence or circumstance. So we have to give up this idea of God's blessing, because at the very core of it, what it's saying is that Europeans are just inherently better than other people. It is a form of racism and a form of elitism to say that God has blessed one particular group of people over another. That's just a very unfair way to look at the world. So I want you to think about medieval life. What kind of life did serfs lead? From where did the king, or and sometimes queen, receive their power in the medieval world? And what kind of philosophical issues did the medieval world deal with? Feel free to pause this and see if you can think about these things. Real-life serfs really were exploited for the majority of the medieval period. Absolutely. They were taken advantage of. They were marginalized. It was not a great job to be a serf. Until about the 14th century, though, when a new invader from Asia disrupts European society. The military forces are absolutely ineffective. There's no way you can engage in diplomacy, and prayers go unanswered. In fact, many people in Europe believed that this invasion was punishment by God. Do you know what I'm talking about? Of course you do. It's the Black Plague, the nice Black Plague world tour. In 1347, although it's not the first time that Europe has dealt with a plague, it is the most devastating time Europe has dealt with a plague. From 1347 to 1349, the Black Plague sweeps along trade routes, and although it originated in China, it really takes hold in Europe. Around 33% and somewhere upwards of 50% in some locations of Europeans' population dies within a couple of years. Now, this is such a devastating loss that people are grasping for reasons why this is happening. And so we get a lot of myth and superstition which arises surrounding this plague. First, a lot of Europeans blamed cats. Why? Why poor cats? What did they ever do to anybody? Well, cats have a pagan association with the demigoddess of magic, Circe. And Circe, because she's the pagan goddess of magic, and magic is the antithesis of prayer, well, therefore, the minions of the devil, cats, must be casting magic spells on people, causing them to be ill. So I told you it was superstition, right? One of the most ridiculous superstitions, though, was this idea that human actions would keep the plague at bay. For example, laughter. Some towns, they forced people to laugh and smile and tell jokes and all that sort of stuff in order to show God that they were happy for being on earth and they didn't need to get the plague because they were very happy to be on earth. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, this doesn't work either. We also have the opposite end of the spectrum with flagellants, the self-flagellants, where they would whip themselves in penance, telling God, oh, please take away, I mortify my flesh in order to take away the sins of the world. It got so bad that the Catholic Church actually banned self-mortification and banned these groups as well. We even see remnants of the psychological impact of the Black Plague in nursery rhymes. A good example is "Ring Around the Rosie." Now, the nursery rhyme is very short. It says "Ring around the Rosie," and Rosie is a shortened word for a rosary that you often wore around your neck. Well, the neck was also the first place that buboles or boils would form when you got the bubonic plague. So "Ring around the Rosie," you had these bruises around your neck. A pocket full of posies. This harkens back to the miasma theory, the idea that foul air is what causes illness, and the way to protect against that is to have sweet-smelling air. And so what better than a pocket full of flowers? Ring around the Rosie, pocket full of posies. And of course it's not ashes, ashes, but achoo, achoo. You got to sneeze. You've got the cold. Achoo, achoo. We all fall down. We all fall down because we're all dead. Kind of grim when you put it in context, isn't it? But there's a silver lining. And I know it's horrible to say, millions of people died, but there's a silver lining. The serfs begin to migrate to cities. There's a demand for labor. They can be a day laborer, they can get into professions, they can become smiths or jewelers or brewers or bakers or whatever, and they can name their own price. Serfs sometimes self-emancipated by changing names and locations. Sometimes they kept the names. They didn't have any lord to worry about. He was dead, or at the very least was very weakened and wasn't looking for him. The serfs, or the yeomen, as they began to become known as, the freemen, often became so affluent that they were able to express their wealth in the clothes that they wore. Before the Black Death, it was fairly easy to tell who was of what station just by what they wore. Now, with the serfs running around in the finest silks that they can afford, the pointiest shoes they can find, and the most brilliantly colored clothes that they can wear, it's hard to tell who was a serf or who was a peasant and who is a noble. So there were many laws that were passed called sumptuary laws or clothing laws. The serfs who remained behind on the farms and in the countryside largely become autonomous. They are able to administer the lands on behalf of their lord, because remember, the plague strikes everybody equally. So those in power, those who were supervising, often found themselves dead as well. And so they needed to rely upon the peasants to organize themselves. And by giving them that much authority over time, the peasants become kind of barracks lawyers. They become quasi-illiterate legal experts in their own right. And they begin to manipulate the system to their advantage. And this is true throughout most of Europe. Even though we have wars that are happening in Europe, and they continue to happen in Europe, and we'll cover one of those wars briefly, there isn't any more acquisition of territory. So there is not really a need for the kings to lead soldiers into battle to acquire territory. So what explains the right of kings to rule? Well, this is where the church comes in. This relationship with the church that had been fostered under earlier kings, under earlier dynasties, really comes to fruition. And essentially, divine right is used to explain why kings or queens are in power. God wills it. And in many ways, this is to keep the society stable. And it does kind of help keep the aristocracy, that plus the feudal system, does keep the aristocracy a little bit in check. Now the feudal system, or at least this concept of the feudal system, is very erroneous. It's a very simplified term for a very complex set of relationships. And anything that is associated with the feudal system, whether it be the pyramid scheme of social structure with the king at the top and the serfs at the bottom, or the fact that oaths of fealty were taken absolutely seriously and never ever questioned, that's an oversimplification. they never really happened that way. Often kings had to contend with dukes or barons or other kings equally at odds with them. But in general, aristocrats did have loyalty to their king. They did work the land or control the land at the behest of the king, and they did levy troops and crops as dictated by the king in general. There were some exceptions to the rule, however, and a really good one is in 1215 when English nobles forced Prince John, the King of England, to sign the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is a document which, for its time, is actually fairly groundbreaking, but it gives you a glimpse into the behaviors of kings prior to Prince John, as well as the expectations and the powers of the nobles. A good paragraph to sum up this kind of context would be this one. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled, nor will we proceed with force against him except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. This is essentially saying that at one point the kings had kind of overstepped their bounds and really pushed the loyalty of the aristocracy, and the aristocracy pushed back. This sets up a tradition of the idea of a constitutional monarchy, although we really don't have a constitution in England just yet. We never really will have one. But later on, the Magna Carta will be hailed as kind of a precursor to the rights of man. And to be fair, it really wasn't. It was the rights of certain men against the king, in this case, the nobles. Although eventually this will work its way into English common law, and those barracks lawyers that I told you about, those serfs, those peasants who were experts in their own right, they will begin to use this to their advantage as well. The late medieval period was also a time of great experimentation with literature, and a really good example of that is the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. It is remarkable for a few reasons. First, it's the first such tale written in what's called the vernacular, the local language, rather than Latin. Second, it's remarkable because it doesn't tell a story about the life of a saint. It's not a reference to the Bible. It is not about the high people of society, but about the middling sort, the average everyday person living in England. The whole of the Canterbury Tales centers on 24 people on this pilgrimage, fulfilling their Christian duty to make a pilgrimage to the chapel at Canterbury, or the cathedral at Canterbury, rather. And each tell tales of their lives and duty. And on the line is, at the end of the journey, the one who has told the best tale will receive a free dinner. So, not a bad deal. It's an epic poem, but it's fragmented. And the fact that it's in the vernacular English gives us an insight into what the language of the time must have been like. My favorite fragment is the third fragment, and this is the wife of Bath, also known as Alison. She's this bawdy woman who Chaucer describes as gap-toothed, which is kind of code for sexually liberated. She's got bushy red hair. She lives life to the fullest, very much a loud laugher and very straight-shooting kind of person. One of the reasons why she's my favorite is because she highlights what life might have been like for a woman in the Middle Ages. And a lot of the concepts that we have about the Middle Ages come to us from the Victorian and Edwardian periods of England, where they went back and revised a lot of these tales to highlight chastity and sexual disdain for sexual intercourse and the denial of pleasure, when the reality is that in medieval period, if you weren't having sex or if you couldn't please your partner, the community knew about it. they learned about it, and they would mock you, or sometimes they would help you, but most of the time they mocked you. So having sex was not a private thing, but something that everybody did and everybody was expected to do. Here's the passage that's one of my favorites in the entire fragment. And on the right we have Middle English, and on the left we have Modern English. And let me give you a little bit of background. Allison was married at a very young age to a very old man who was very wealthy. And on her wedding night, she realized that she liked sex. So, with that in mind, she says, "Praise be to God, I have wedded five men, and welcome the sixth whenever he shall come. Forsooth, I'll not keep chaste for good and all. When my husband is gone from the world, some Christian man will wed me some day. Better to marry than to burn with lust within." So she's saying that, yes, sex is awesome. We love sex. Sex is great. In fact, the tale is, or at least the inference is that she likes sex so much, she wears her husbands out, and they wind up dying an early death. So, go figure. By the 1500s, to put it in context, Europe is relatively poor. Compared to Asia and Japan, India, the Ottoman Empire, or the burgeoning Ottoman Empire in the 1500s, and the Aztecs and the Incas, Europe is really kind of on the bottom rung of wealth and standard of living. In fact, Europe has a largely negative trade balance. The majority of money is leaving Europe in order to pay for luxuries such as silk or dyes or incense. And so European navigation in the 1400s is born out of necessity to get better access to luxury goods, cheaper prices, as well as access to food preservation and food flavor enhancement. So I want you to think about what you had for dinner last night. What kind of spices were in it? Was there pepper, chilies, cumin, allspice, cinnamon, sugar, nutmeg, thyme? Most of those are actually not from Europe, except for thyme. Thyme is a nice little plant there. And I want you to think about the food in your fridge. Do you have meat or eggs or milk? How long do you think that stuff will last without refrigeration? And on a limited budget, would you throw away meat that was just a little smelly, maybe starting to turn a little bit? You weren't quite sure about it? Why? Or why wouldn't you? Well, let's backpedal a little bit, and we'll talk about the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road is a series of trade routes that stretch from China all the way to Europe. In fact, the term Silk Road was coined in the 18th century by a German historian to describe the prominent product that China produced, the bolts of silk that were so highly prized in Europe. And it was both overland and overseas. And these routes brought very expensive goods to Europe. Oh, there we are. At about the same time that we are looking at an increasing rise of desire for these products, as well as an inability to access them, and we'll get to why that is in a little bit. About the same time, the Portuguese prince named Henry the Navigator, nicknamed Henry the Navigator, was fascinated with the idea of exploration and maps, and he funded a lot of expeditions in order to discover new lands for the Portuguese. Some believe that he was looking for an alternate route to India and China, and that may very well be true, but also to expand the prestige and wealth of the Portuguese. And it begins this really rich tradition of Portuguese navigators and explorers. I put navigators on quotation marks there because some not so very much navigate-y, more on the pirate-y side. I'm looking at you, Vasco da Gama. Bartolomeo Diaz, for example, is the first to round the Cape of Good Hope, the southern portion of, not quite the southern tip, but pretty close to Africa. And Vasco da Gama, who first makes a successful voyage into the Indian Ocean from Europe. So here we are. So Bartolomeo Diaz, he rounds the Cape of Good Hope, makes it to the other side and into the Indian Ocean, but then, of course, heads back. Vasco da Gama in 1497 to 1498 eventually makes the trip all the way to Calicut, India. Now, why were these products becoming more difficult to obtain? Well, part of it has to do with what's happening on the Iberian Peninsula. By 1492, the last Muslim caliphate in Iberia has fallen, the Caliphate of Granada. The Reconquista, a 700-ish year-long on-again, off-again campaign to kick Muslims out of Iberia, has finally culminated with the capitulation of the final Muslim caliphate in 1492. It doesn't mean that Muslims and Christians are now no longer at war. Far be it, but that's another fish to fry. Muslims and Jews begin to flee to places like Morocco and eventually to the Ottoman Empire. Some who remain convert to Catholicism. Muslims become known as Moriscos. Jews become conversos. And they try to integrate into Spanish society. Unfortunately, the Spanish Church, which is Catholic, although initially Cardinal Jimenez said that he had authorization from the Pope. He did have blessing from the King of Spain to conduct the Reconquista. Later on, the Pope would say, nope, you don't have right to do this, that you're going way overboard, you're hurting people too much, really picks up after 1492. And although it began in 1478, this attempt to purify Iberia of non-Catholic forces, or non-Catholic people, it really intensified after 1492. The use of secret informants that would then rat somebody out, they would be captured, tortured into confessing that they were either still worshiping their false god. If they confessed, they were executed. If they didn't confess, they were tortured until they died. On top of it, there was censorship. Any critique of the church or critique of the Spanish crown was met harshly. Portugal also has its own Inquisition in the 1530s, as does Rome a little bit later. At the same time that the Reconquista is winding up, the Byzantine Empire, the last little vestige of the Roman Empire, is conquered by Mehmet the Conqueror in 1453. So when the final Christian bastion in the Middle East is gone, and essentially moving the capital of the Ottoman Empire to this grand city of Constantinople, now the Ottomans sit astride a large chunk of the Silk Road. Many of the Jews and Muslims fleeing the Reconquista do find sanctuary in Constantinople, and although they are second-class citizens, they're much better off than they are in Europe. News of the Inquisition comes with them, and so I want you to think, if you were the Ottoman Empire in, say, 1580 or even 1492, what would your reaction to Spanish people coming to trade in your empire would be? The Italian city-states, however, are doing not so badly. Although the Italian peninsula is divided amongst powerful and wealthy city-states, the conquest of the Middle East actually assists the Italians in ways that they hadn't even guessed. The cities of Genoa and Pisa and Venice and Florence and Milan become incredibly wealthy because they've established contacts both in the medieval Roman church, in the medieval Roman markets, as well as the medieval Ottoman markets. So they have very nice contacts, and on top of it, they've made some good money transporting people to the Holy Land during the Crusades. So by the time we get to the late 14th and early 15th century, the vast majority of those goods that are coming along the Silk Road pass through Italian brokers, Italian city-states. And with it comes a lot of money. The combination of wealth and access to not just goods, but also learning in the Middle East, leads to what we call the Renaissance in Italy by the late 14th century. So why do we refer to it as Renaissance? Well, partly it's a pejorative term to differentiate from medieval or the so-called Dark Ages period, the rebirth of human learning and understanding. There's an alternation of artistic styles that is part of this liberal experimentation with colors and traditions and sense, and also the idea of how human beings are put together, physiology and kinesthesiology. It also leads to the rise of new forms of government. Although technically still a plutocracy, Florence experiences a kind of republic where people do get the chance to vote, although in reality very powerful families are the ones who dominate the politics. And Italy becomes a center of scientific investigation and learning. And these all kind of enmesh within each other to really change how Europeans see the world. Let me give you an example. Here's some medieval art from the middle of the 15th century by a master painter. And here we have a scene in a church. There's no real sense of depth, no sense of perception. Everybody's kind of at awkward angles. They don't look very lifelike, do they? And also, what direction is that Bible pointing towards? Is it pointing up towards God, or is it pointing towards the chorus? Is it pointing towards me? I don't understand. Where does that door go, and why does it open that way? It looks kind of weird, doesn't it? Now compare this with a Renaissance painting of the School of Athens. In this, we can see references not to Christian life, but to pagan life, to Greek life, to pre-Christian times in Europe. You can also see flowing, fluid movement, people who are in natural poses, except maybe that guy who's passed out on the front of the steps. I also see references to the gods and goddesses of ancient Greece. And finally, you can see perspective. The archway in the very back is obviously farther away than the archway in the middle ground, obviously farther away than the archway in the foreground. And so we have this kind of amazing transformation of European art, thanks in large part to investigations into physiology and anatomy and kinesthesiology. We have Renaissance advancements that proliferate in Italy, and this Renaissance begins to percolate out. It eventually hits France, and it goes on into England and into the German states, and even as far away as Scotland. So, as I mentioned before, I want you to imagine that you are a Spaniard or a Portuguese in the end of the 15th century. Are you willing to give up luxuries such as spices, dyes, sugar, silk? What kind of welcome do you think you might get when trading in Constantinople? Now, put this on the other shoe. Now, you're an Italian. Would you fund Columbus's harebrained scheme to move westward to find the very luxuries that you are trading in already? What danger is there if you fund Columbus's expedition? Remember, Christopher Columbus is Italian. He shops this idea around Italy all the time, and eventually he makes his way to the Iberian Peninsula. In 1492, he eventually finds sponsorship, and I do have to dispel a myth. Some people still think that at the point that Christopher Columbus sailed westward, he was trying to prove that the world was round. He already knew that the world was round. In fact, the majority of educated people knew that the world was round. It goes all the way back to Ptolemy and ancient Greek mathematicians. He was actually looking for an easy route to India or China, if you have to, by going westward. His ships, the Santa Clara, also known as the Nina, because it's so tiny, it's a little sister, the Pinta and the Santa Maria head westward. And the discovery of the New World changes the Europeans' game. They had not known that there was a couple of continents in their way and on the way to India, but I actually think it turned out better for Europeans than if they had gotten to India directly. And so here's the many voyages of Christopher Columbus. As you see, he made several of them, mapping out the early parts of what would later become the Empire of Spain. Now, we're going to harken back a little bit. I'm going to ask you to remember when I called Vasco da Gama a gigantic pirate, which he really is. He was also an explorer. At the same time that Christopher Columbus is heading west, trying to find India on behalf of Spain, Vasco da Gama is sailing southward in order to find a route to India and beyond. Initially, he tries to pass himself off as a Muslim, but he doesn't do a very good job of that, and so decides to attack and burn Muslim vessels, capturing their cargo. So he's basically a pirate. He eventually lands in Calicut in 1498, and he begins trading for spices and looking for Christian allies. He is responding to this pervasive hoax in the medieval period that there's an immortal king of a Christian kingdom somewhere in India who is guarding the gates of the Garden of Eden, and that he is this powerful Christian king, and he just needs to be roused in order to expunge non-believing Muslims from the world. Well, he doesn't find Christian allies, but he does find peppercorns, black peppercorns. And his return voyage to India nets him a 300% profit. An amazing amount of profit, even considering he loses one of his ship and about half of his men. Still, he makes up for the loss and then some. So a 300% profit for that entire voyage. This prompts the Portuguese to attempt to conquer a chunk of India in Calicut, and he's eventually driven out by the Muslim Mughal Empire. But they do establish a small stronghold in the port town of Goa, G-O-A, that allows the Portuguese to have this kind of roving control of the Indian Ocean, particularly the Arabian Sea. The Portuguese begin to ally with the Hindus, the small Hindu states in the southern part of India, against the Mughal Empire to attempt to bring the Mughal Empire down. But India is not the stopping point either. Once the gates have been opened, and once it's feasible and technologically possible to get to India from Europe, eventually explorers make their way to China, and of course it's the Portuguese again. They arrive in China in 1514. I know it's a little outside of our time, as will the next slide be, but it's important to put it in context. The Portuguese arrive in China in 1514, and they are extremely offensive to Chinese sensibilities. First, they smell. When you're at sea and you need to wash your clothes, soap will not lather in salt water, and you're not going to waste fresh water to wash clothes with. Well, another way that you can wash clothes is by urine, using urine, an old medieval trick. It makes whites whiter than any before, and keeps colors safe, and it gets tar out of the fabric and all this sort of stuff. Problem is the lasting smell. Really offensive. And on top of that, the Portuguese acted like they owned the place when they arrive in Canton. They're eventually driven out by the Chinese, and they don't return until 40 years later. When they finally return, they are allowed to set up trading in a port city called Macau, but they must pay yearly tribute to continue trading in China, and the Chinese refuse to treat the Portuguese as equals. These are barbarians in every sense of the word, and they are coming looking for our products and bringing just gold, and nothing else really appeals to the Chinese. And this sets up a paradigm that is true in Europe all the way to the 19th century. Very, very few products are consumed by India. Very few products produced by Europeans are consumed by China. I'm sorry. And it's not until the middle of the 19th century, but that's a whole nother ball of wax and a whole nother lecture and a whole nother class. Eventually, they proceed further eastward, the Portuguese do, and eventually make it to Japan. And by 1542, the Portuguese have arrived in Japan. This time, their trade deputation includes missionaries, and also they bring some products that they know that the Chinese liked, and so they hope that the Japanese would like as well. The Portuguese almost immediately begin to learn Japanese language and customs. They kowtow to the shogun, who is the military leader of Japan. If you've never heard of the term kowtow, it means to basically abase yourself in front of the shogun. You get down on your hands and knees and put your face to the floor, and you don't get up until he says it's okay. Some records of the time say that these kowtows can last a really long time. At one point, the shogun left a warlord, a Japanese warlord, in the kowtow for 24 hours. So that's pretty intense. So showing meekness in the eyes of the elite, and very quietly spreading Christianity, very surreptitiously spreading Christianity in order to cultivate allies amongst the Japanese. So I want you to think about the Portuguese experience in foreign lands. Why do you think the Portuguese were so offensive in India and China? Do you approve of their change in tactics in Japan? Why? Or why not? Why doesn't Portugal hold its monopoly over trade after the 16th century? What do you think happens with Italian wealth as these new trade routes open both to the west and to the south? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? All right, that is it for this week. Don't forget to read Mackay chapter 14 in the sources, of course, because that's going to have the Crusades. And there are going to be additional resources online. And as always, if you have any problems, please email me as soon as possible. You guys have a great week, and I'll see you again next week.